Something is happening right now in offices, warehouses, restaurants, and corporate parks across the country. And nobody who runs those places can explain it. A generation gets hired, learns the job, shows up on time, hits their targets, and then the second someone says, "Can you stay a few extra hours?" they say no. Not rudely, not dramatically, not with a speech. They just say no, pack their bag, and leave at 5 p.m. like they were born knowing that 5 p.m. was a hard limit. And the bosses are spiraling. HR is writing new onboarding documents. Managers are going on podcast. Economists are getting quoted in Forbes calling it a work ethic collapse. LinkedIn is absolutely on fire with 45-year-old executives writing open letters to today's youth about the value of going the extra mile. One of those posts got 400,000 impressions. It was shared mostly by other 45-year-old executives agreeing with each other. Meanwhile, the extra mile generated approximately 0% of their net worth. Just to give you a sense of scale, surveys run across 2023 and 2024 consistently showed that somewhere between 60 and 70% of GenZ workers actively resist or outright refuse unplanned overtime. That number jumps even higher when you ask specifically about unpaid overtime, which, surprise, is still extremely common in professional settings. Not because people are being coerced into it, but because the culture of staying late to show commitment has been so deeply embedded in corporate environments that many workers don't even realize they're being asked to donate their time to a for-profit organization, and GenZ just opted out. Not because they can't do the work, not because they're tired, because they've decided collectively and somewhat instinctively that the trade isn't worth it, but there's something structurally wrong with the deal. And when you actually look at the math, and I mean really look at it, not the motivational poster version, but the actual numbers, they are not wrong. So, here's the question that should be genuinely bothering you. If overtime was always a bad deal, why did every generation before this one accept it so quietly? What did they know that made it feel reasonable? What changed? And what does the answer mean for how you think about your own time right now? We're going to explain how the overtime system works and why it's getting weird. Not from a kids these days a soft angle, not from a motivational hard work pays off angle, purely from an incentives angle, from a systems angle. Because the moment you stop looking at this as a generational culture war and start looking at it as a machine, you see exactly why the machine is breaking down and, more importantly, what that actually tells you about how wealth really gets built. Here's the metaphor I want you to keep in your head for this entire video. Think of traditional employment as a conveyor belt. Hoster, you step on, it moves at a fixed speed, you go forward, you get paid for how long you stand on it. That's the deal. And for a long time, that deal made complete sense. You could stand on the belt for 8 hours, collect your wage, and the belt would carry you towards something real. A pension, a house, a stable retirement, a life that was perceptibly better than the one your parents had. The destination was visible. The belt was moving toward it at a reasonable rate. But here's what happened over time. The belt speed stayed exactly the same. Your wage grew slower than prices. And the destination, financial security, home ownership, real retirement, kept drifting further away. The belt didn't accelerate. The finish line moved. And the only advice the system offered to solve this problem was run faster, work more hours, give more of your time to the machine. So now you've got a new generation stepping onto the conveyor belt, looking at the destination, doing the math, and thinking if I run on this thing as hard as I can, I get there maybe 8 or 10% faster. But I also wear out my shoes, blow out my knees, burn through my cognitive energy, sacrifice my evenings and my weekends, and arrive exhausted at a finish line that has still been moving while I was running. And then what? I rest on a slightly smaller savings account in a slightly worse housing market. That's the setup. Keep the conveyor belt in mind because everything I'm about to tell you connects directly back to it, and by the end you'll see why the metaphor matters more than it initially seems. Let's start with the most basic version of this problem. The one that should be obvious but somehow isn't taught anywhere. Overtime pays 1.5 times your base rate. That's the legal floor in most jurisdictions. So if you make $20 an hour, overtime is $30 an hour. Sounds good. People have been sold that story for decades. Time and a half. It has a friendly ring to it. It sounds like the system is compensating you fairly for your sacrifice, acknowledging the value of your personal time. Now, let's run the actual numbers and see if that holds. You make $20 an hour. You work 40 hours a week. Your gross weekly pay is $800. Now, your employer asks you to stay an extra 10 hours. At $30 an hour, that's an additional $300 gross. Total gross for the week, $1,100. That's a 37.5% increase in gross pay. Not bad on paper. Oh, here's where it gets interesting. Your base 40-hour check puts you in a certain tax bracket. The moment you layer in those overtime hours, your annualized income projection jumps into a higher band. Depending on your state, your deductions, and your filing status, a meaningful portion of that extra $300 gets clawed back at the marginal rate. After federal income tax, state income tax where applicable, Social Security contribution, Medicare contribution, your actual take-home from those 10 hours might land somewhere between $150 and $190. On a good week, maybe $200 if the stars align. Let me be concrete. Say your after-tax take-home on that $300 gross is $170. That's $17 per hour of actual money hitting your account. Your base rate after taxes might be somewhere around $14 or $15 depending on your situation. So yes, overtime nets you more. Of course it does. But the premium isn't 1.5 times. The real premium is closer to 1.1 or 1.2 times. You're working 10 extra hours. Hours that could have been spent sleeping, recovering, building something, existing as a human being for roughly a 15 to 20% bump in actual take-home pay. 15 to 20%, not 50%, not even close to 50%. 15 to 20%. And this is before you account for any of the soft costs, the commute to cover those extra hours, the meal you're buying because you didn't have time to prep dinner, the childcare you need to extend, the gym session you skip because you're exhausted, the cognitive fog the next morning that makes you slightly less productive, which costs you in ways that are genuinely hard to quantify, but absolutely real. GenZ looked at that number, probably not through a formal spreadsheet analysis, but through an accumulation of observed outcomes and absorbed information and said, no thanks. And I want to emphasize something here because I think it gets missed in every conversation about this topic. Most of the people declining overtime are not doing it for a conscious, rational calculation. They're doing it through collective intuition, through patterns they've absorbed watching their parents, their older siblings, their relatives, people in their community who followed the overtime path and didn't arrive anywhere dramatically better for it. Intuition in large groups is often smarter than any individual spreadsheet precisely because it integrates more data points than any single analysis can capture. The gut is running a calculation. The calculation is just distributed. What they're really doing without necessarily knowing the terminology is applying an opportunity cost framework. They're asking, what else could I do with 10 hours? And the answer, even if they can't articulate it cleanly, is something that either restores my capacity or compounds over time. Overtime does neither. It depletes your capacity because 10 extra hours of work is 10 extra hours of cognitive and physical expenditure. And it doesn't compound. You do it this week, you get paid for it this week. It evaporates. It's a linear transaction on a conveyor belt that doesn't accelerate no matter how fast you're moving your feet. That's layer 1. Let's go deeper. Now, here's where the story gets structurally darker, and this part is important because it reframes overtime from bad financial trade to intentional system feature. Overtime isn't just a poor deal in isolation. It was specifically designed as a cost efficiency mechanism for employers, not as a wealth-building tool for employees. Let me walk through the math on the employer side because this is where the real story lives. When a company faces a work surge, a big project, a seasonal spike, a product launch, they have two options. Option 1, hire additional people to cover the load. Option 2, extend existing employees' hours. On the surface, these seem like equivalent solutions. You're getting the same work done either way, but they are categorically not equivalent from the employer's financial perspective. Bringing on a new full-time employee costs money before they produce a single dollar of value. You have recruiting costs, which can run anywhere from $3,000 to $20,000 per hire, depending on seniority and industry. You have onboarding time, which in many professional roles means 2 to 6 weeks of reduced productivity. You have benefits overhead, health insurance, retirement contributions, employment taxes which can add 20 to 40% on top of salary. You have the friction of equipment, desk space, access credentials, training time from existing staff. And if the work surge is temporary, you're now committed to a fixed employment cost that continues after the surge is gone. Option 2. Overtime eliminates almost all of that. The employee is already trained. They already have their equipment and their access and their institutional knowledge. The only incremental cost is the premium rate. And here's the key. In many labor-intensive industries and in many white-collar environments, it is meaningfully cheaper to work 10 employees 60 hours a week than to hire 15 employees for 40 hours a week. The math when you include all fixed employment costs often makes overtime the better deal for the company by a significant margin. So when your employer asks you to work overtime, they are not doing you a favor. They are not rewarding your dedication. They are running an efficiency calculation that determined overtime is cheaper than headcount. Your willingness to say yes makes their model work. Your willingness to say yes is from the company's perspective a resource to be managed and optimized, not a relationship to be honored. I want to be really clear here that I'm not saying your employer is evil. I'm not saying your manager is a villain. Most managers who ask for overtime are just doing their jobs, which involves managing labor costs. The incentive structure rewards them for keeping headcount lean and using overtime as a flexible labor buffer. So that's what they do. The critique here is aimed entirely at the design of the system, not at any individual operating within it. Now, here's the second and more insidious layer of the structural trap. And this one does real damage to people's careers in ways they don't see coming. Once you establish yourself as someone who works overtime, the expectation resets, and it doesn't reset dramatically or all at once. It happens incrementally, almost imperceptibly, over months. The first time you stay late, it's appreciated and acknowledged. The second time, it's noted, but less remarkable. The third time, it's baseline. By the 6th month, staying until 7 p.m. is simply what you do. It's now baked into how your performance is perceived, how your workload is calibrated, and how your manager describes your role to their manager. And then here's the trap. To be seen as exceptional again, you have to exceed the new baseline. You can't just go back to the old level of output. That would look like a performance decline. You have to do more than your already elevated baseline to stand out. And if you do that, the cycle repeats. The baseline resets again. The bar rises again. The effort required to maintain your perceived level of contribution increases, but your salary doesn't rise proportionally because salary is calibrated to market rates in your title, not to the number of hours you volunteered. This is the conveyor belt running under your feet while you're already running at full speed. The belt isn't going faster. You're just working harder to stay in the same place relative to your peers who didn't establish the same baseline. I've observed this pattern enough times in people I've talked to in patterns across industries, and the data on salary versus hours work to tell you it's not random. It's structural. Companies don't intend to trap workers in escalating effort cycles. But the system rewards managers who extract maximum output and punishes managers who see productivity decline. So the incentive to keep ratcheting up the baseline is always present even without any malicious intent. Now you might be thinking, okay, fine, overtime expectations become your baseline, but surely working more hours increases your chance of promotion. Doesn't more visibility mean more advancement sometimes? But the relationship is significantly weaker than most people assume, and in knowledge economy environments is sometimes negative. Research on promotion plans consistently shows that advancement in corporate hierarchies correlates much more strongly with perceived strategic value being associated with important projects, building relationships with decision makers, demonstrating judgment rather than just execution, than with raw hours logged. The person who works 70 hours a week in quiet execution is often invisible to the people making promotion decisions. The person who works 50 hours but attends the right meetings, contributes to the right conversations, and makes their supervisor look good at the right moments advances faster. Not because the system is fair, because the system measures visibility and political capital, not aggregate effort. Gen Z being a generation raised in an environment saturated with performance optimization, gaming, social platforms, content algorithms, streaming recommendations, has internalized this dynamic faster than previous generations. You don't grind the wrong mechanic. You figure out what the system is actually rewarding and you optimize for that. In corporate advancement, the mechanic is often not work the most hours. The mechanic is closer to be strategically visible and make people above you feel successful. Those are different skills and they don't require staying until 8 p.m. Alright. Now, here's the part that actually changes the conversation because I've been telling you what's wrong with overtime. But the more interesting question is what Gen Z is doing instead, or at least what the financially literate segment of them is doing. Because the media version of this story, the version that gets the most engagement and the most outrage clicks, is Gen Z refuses to work, spends all their time on TikTok. That version is both partially true and almost entirely misleading. Here's what's actually true. Gen Z entered the workforce at a specific moment in history where information about personal finance, investing, wealth building, and alternative income became radically more accessible than at any prior point. Not just available, genuinely comprehensible, not locked behind financial advisor paywalls or dense academic papers, explained clearly for free by people their age on platforms they already used. A 22-year-old in 2024 has access to a quality of financial education that a 35-year-old in 1994 would have had to pay a professional hundreds of dollars per hour to receive, assuming they could even find the right professional. Concepts like compound interest, index fund investing, tax-advantaged accounts, leverage, passive income, asymmetric bets. This information is now widely distributed and fluently understood by a large segment of younger people. So, they know what compound interest does. They understand what index funds are. They've absorbed what passive income looks like. They've watched people build real online businesses from nothing. They've seen founders, creators, traders, and skilled freelancers accumulate genuine wealth in compressed time frames. And they've done the comparison honestly. Let me show you the comparison in concrete numbers. Nobody. Two people, both 23 years old, both working the same job, earning $48,000 a year, roughly $23 an hour. 40-hour weeks. Let's call them Marcus and Daniel. Marcus's employer offers consistent overtime opportunities, roughly 10 extra hours per week, and a lot of his colleagues take them. Marcus joins in. His additional gross per week is approximately $345 at 1.5 times his base. After marginal taxes, he takes home somewhere around $210 to $220 per week of net overtime income. Over 5 years, that's roughly $54,000 in total net overtime take home. Let's be generous and say he manages to save $20,000 of it, which for someone in their mid-20s is genuinely optimistic given that lifestyle inflation tends to absorb extra income almost as fast as it arrives. His savings rate on overtime income is actually pretty good at this estimate. Daniel says no to overtime consistently. He is not lazy. He takes those 10 weekly hours and deploys them with intent. He puts $450 a month into a broad market index fund, money he can afford because he's not filling his extra hours with consumption-based entertainment that costs money. He also spends 3 or 4 hours a week building a specific skill, in his case, writing and content creation, which is almost zero startup cost. By year 2, he has a small client base paying him a flat monthly retainer for content work. Conservative estimate, $800 a month from that by year 2, growing modestly from there. After 5 years, where are they? Marcus has $20,000 in overtime savings. His salary has grown at roughly 4% annually, which after real inflation is effectively flat in purchasing power. He is given approximately 2,600 hours of overtime labor over those 5 years. That's more than an entire year of standard working hours donated in blocks of evenings and weekends over half a decade. He is measurably more fatigued than when he started. Research on chronic overwork, and this is well documented across occupational health literature, shows degraded decision-making, reduced creativity, and increased error rates in workers who consistently exceed 50 to 55 hours per week. Marcus is not the same performer he was. He's slower. He's more reactive. He's less imaginative. The overtime didn't just cost him his evenings. It cost him some of his cognitive edge. Daniel has an investment portfolio worth approximately $32,000 from consistent contributions, plus compound growth and 8% average annual return. He has a content client base generating roughly $1,200 per month by year 3 and growing. His total accumulated financial position from those overtime-free years is somewhere around $70,000 to $80,000 ahead of where he'd be if he had worked overtime and spent it. And here's the crucial part. His side income doesn't terminate at the end of a pay period. His investments compound without him. His content skills give him leverage. He can charge more per hour than his employer pays him. He can take on more clients. He can eventually build something that doesn't require his constant presence to generate revenue. He's not on the conveyor belt for those returns. He stepped off it during those extra 10 hours and built something that moves independently. Now, and I want to be very deliberate here, this math doesn't work automatically. If Daniel had spent those 10 hours on Netflix and restaurant tabs, he'd be slightly poorer than Marcus, not richer. The math only works if he actually deploys the time into something that builds. That's the thing the Gen Z is lazy narrative is technically pointing at, even if it's pointing at it with the wrong frame. Some of them are not building anything in their off hours. Some of them genuinely are optimizing for comfort, and comfort doesn't compound. But the ones who are building the framework is completely correct. They are running a better system. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, systems, real numbers, incentives, subscribe. This is the only type of content I make, and I put it out consistently. One subscription is cheaper than one bad financial decision, and you might prevent a few. Let me give you a specific grounded case study to make this concrete in a way that sticks. Imagine a guy named Ryan. He's 24. He works in IT support at a mid-size logistics company. Base salary is $55,000 per year. His employer frequently offers overtime because IT infrastructure issues don't observe business hours. Something is always on fire, always needs patching, always needs someone to stay late and deal with it. Most of his team takes the overtime. The premium is real. The money shows up in their checks. A couple of his colleagues are pulling an extra $15,000 to $20,000 gross per year from overtime alone. Ryan watches this for about 8 months. He does some overtime himself in the beginning, partly to learn, partly to feel out the environment, and then he stops. He makes this decision not based on principle, but based on a specific observation. The colleagues taking the most overtime and not significantly ahead financially. They're driving nicer cars. They're eating out more often. Their lifestyle has inflated to match their income, which is one of the most reliable patterns in personal finance. The extra money is real, but it's not building anything. It's converting into consumption as fast as it arrives. Ryan decides to do something different with his evenings. He spends roughly 8 to 10 hours per week. Not all of it, just a focused chunk. Learning a specific technical skill set, workflow automation, using tools his employer hasn't adopted, and that most small and mid-sized businesses haven't either. This is a real and sizable gap in the market. Most enterprise-grade automation tools require significant technical knowledge to implement and are priced beyond what small businesses can afford. But a reasonably skilled person can build functional automated workflows for small businesses at a fraction of the enterprise cost. Ryan is competent at this within about 9 months. He documents his work. He builds a small portfolio of examples. He updates his professional profile to reflect the capability. He starts spending a few weekend hours a month doing outreach on business forums and professional platforms, positioning himself not as a freelancer looking for gigs, but as a specialist solving a specific, well-defined problem. Within 3 months of starting outreach, he has 2 clients on retainer arrangements. Together, they're paying him $2,200 per month flat, which he negotiated as project-based rather than hourly, which is important because it decouples his income from his time more directly. That's $26,400 annually in additional income. Now, let's compare him to his colleague James. Same age, same base salary, consistent overtime at roughly 10 hours per week. James' overtime gross at 1.5 times his base rate. 55,000 divided by 2, 80 hours gives roughly $26.40 per hour. Time 1.5 equals approximately $39.60, nets him around $390 to $400 gross per week before taxes. After taxes, somewhere between $250 and $270 per week in actual take-home annually. That's around $13,000 to $14,000 of net overtime income. Ryan earns $26,400 from consulting. Before taxes, he pays taxes on it. Obviously, let's say after taxes, he keeps about $19,000. Still 40% more than James in total extra income. But more importantly, and this is the part that the gross income comparison misses, Ryan's consulting income is not tied to his physical presence in a specific building for specific hours. He works when he chooses to work on those projects. He is not on call. He is not available at 7 p.m. when the server goes down because someone at his employer's company made a configuration error. His non-employment time is genuinely his. By year 2, Ryan has 3 clients. By year 3, he has built a simple process around his service, a scoped intake questionnaire, a standardized delivery timeline, template components he reuses across clients that allows him to deliver the same quality of work in significantly less time. He's not working more hours. He's working smarter hours. The same amount of time is producing more output because he's built a system, not just a service. Rates. James, by contrast, has been consistently valuable to his employer, has received a couple of modest raises, and is quietly burned out. Not dramatically, not noticeably, at least not yet. But the 10+ hour per week average of constant availability is compounded into fatigue the same way Ryan's investments compounded into returns, just in the opposite direction. At the end of year 3, Ryan is earning more total money than James, has a more flexible schedule, has a skill set that commands premium rates in a market that's growing, and has investment accounts that are growing in the background. James has some savings, a good reputation at work, and the nagging sense that something isn't quite adding up. The moral of the case study is not consulting is better than employment. The moral is that the conveyor belt can only deliver you to one place at one speed, regardless of how hard you run on it. Ryan built a ramp that runs parallel to it. It took time to build. It was genuinely difficult. But it runs on its own now, and he doesn't have to run. A senior manager of Fortune 500 company is quoted in a major business publication explaining that GenZ employees lack the commitment that built this company. The company's stock has underperformed the S&P 500 by roughly 5 to 7% annually for the past decade. Its top 5 executives received a combined compensation package of $38 million last year, including equity grants that vest over time regardless of whether the stock performs. Next Thursday, employees are being asked to stay late for a product launch event. Pizza will be provided. There will be 4 large pies for approximately 58 people. The pizza will arrive 40 minutes late. Someone will take the last slice of the one vegetarian option before half the room has arrived. This will be described in the company newsletter as a great team moment. Now, let me do the full reversal because everything I've walked you through up to this point has been building to this, and I want to be precise about it. You think the problem is that Gen Z has a weak work ethic. But actually, the problem is incentive design. Those are not the same diagnosis, and they require completely different solutions. Here's how I know the work ethic framing is wrong. If overtime actually produced meaningful compounding financial outcomes, Gen Z would do it. This generation is not ideologically opposed to effort. The evidence against the laziness narrative is overwhelming once you stop looking at hours in an office and start looking at actual productive output. They run multiple content accounts. They build Shopify stores on weekends. They freelance on platforms while employed full-time. They study for certifications at midnight. They manage communities, build audiences, create products, run social experiments to test market demand, negotiate brand deals all alongside their day jobs. They're not avoiding effort. They're auditing where their effort goes. And selectivity in a world of genuinely finite time is not a character failure. It's rational resource allocation. The people calling them lazy are measuring work ethic by one variable: hours of visible effort inside a corporate building. But that is measuring an input, not an output. Hours inside a building are the cost side of the equation. Wealth, optionality, health, financial security, those are the output side. Confusing the input for the output is how you end up grinding for 35 years and wondering why the conveyor belt didn't take you further. The real incentive design problem is this. Most companies have built evaluation systems where the primary visible signal of commitment and competence is presence and hours. Not output per hour, not quality of decisions, not leverage created, not problem solved, just are you here? Are you here early? Are you still here when I walk by at 6:30? The manager who sees you at your desk at 7 p.m. concludes without conscious analysis that you are dedicated. The manager who watches you leave at 5 p.m. concludes also without conscious analysis that you are less dedicated. This happens even when your 5 p.m. colleague produces dramatically more value per hour than your 7 p.m. colleague. This metric made intuitive sense in a manufacturing context, a factory context, an agricultural context, where more hours of labor directly and linearly translated to more output. More hours on the assembly line equals more units assembled. The correlation was real. The measurement proxy was valid. But in a knowledge economy, which is the dominant context for most office-based Gen Z workers, the relationship between hours and output is not linear. It's not even consistently positive beyond a certain threshold. There is robust and well-replicated research showing that cognitive performance, the quality of decisions, the creativity of solutions, the accuracy of analysis degrades meaningfully beyond 50 hours of work per week. Some studies put the degradation threshold closer to 45 hours. The output produced in hours 50 through 60 is often measurably inferior to the output produced in hours 30 through 40. You're paying for more hours and getting less value per hour. The math doesn't even work on its own terms. So the company that brags about its culture of long hours and hard work is in a knowledge work environment, often optimizing for a theater of effort that doesn't actually track to output. They're measuring presence because output is genuinely harder to measure in knowledge work, and because the culture of measuring presence was imported wholesale from a manufacturing paradigm that no longer applies. Gen Z sees through this partly because they grew up in an environment completely saturated with real performance measurement followers, engagement rates, conversion percentages, algorithm performance, streaks, leaderboards, ratings. They understand intuitively what a real metric looks like and what a proxy metric looks like. Number of hours in the building is a proxy metric with weak correlation to actual value created. They're declining to be evaluated on it, which is actually kind of a reasonable position when you think about it without the generational defensiveness. And this is where I want to give you the framework that ties everything together. There are 3 levels at which people understand the overtime question. And knowing which level you're operating from is one of the more practically useful things I can offer you. Level 1 is where the majority of the workforce lives, has always lived, and will probably continue to live. At level 1, you believe that effort is the primary variable. More hours equals more progress. Overtime is straightforwardly good because more money is straightforwardly good, and more money is the reward for more effort. You optimize for gross income without accounting for tax drag on marginal hours, without calculating opportunity cost, without modeling the compound effects of time redirected toward asset building. You are running on the conveyor belt, and you believe that running faster is the primary way to improve your situation. Most people never leave level 1. They stay on the belt for their entire working life. Occasionally running faster, occasionally exhausted enough to slow down, but never stepping off to question the design of the system or examine the speed of the belt or ask why the destination keeps moving. Level 1 isn't stupid. It's what the environment teaches by default. School teaches it. Most management culture reinforces it. It's the water. Level 2 is where the insight hits. This is where you begin doing the actual math, not the gross math, the net math. You calculate what overtime really delivers after taxes. You start genuinely examining the opportunity cost of each extra hour sold. You begin to see that the premium isn't what it's advertised to be. You recognize that the baseline ratchet effect exists and that it's quietly working against you. You start to understand that the return on your time in a job context is fundamentally capped in a way that returns in other contexts are not. This is broadly where Gen Z operates. They've collectively internalized level 2 thinking faster than any prior generation, often without formal financial education through absorption of patterns and outcomes and information that wasn't available to earlier cohorts at the same age. The refusal to work overtime is largely a level 2 behavior, a recognition that the trade is structurally bad, even when there isn't a specific alternative plan behind it. Level 3 is where things actually change for you financially. Level 3 is not just refusing the bad trade. It's identifying and executing a better one. At level 3, you stop asking, how do I earn more per hour? And start asking, how do I build structures that generate returns when I'm not present? You identify your highest leverage capability and package it in ways that aren't tied to your hourly availability. You invest consistently enough and early enough that compounding begins doing real work on your behalf. Not meaningful work immediately, but work that compounds into meaningful returns over years and decades. You start thinking about what it means to own a piece of something rather than sell hours into something. Level 3 is not achieved by refusing overtime. Refusing overtime is the clearing move. You remove the thing that was colonizing your time. What you put in that space determines whether you end up financially ahead or just less tired. And here's the criticism of Gen Z that I think actually has some validity. A lot of them are at level 2. They've correctly identified the bad trade, but haven't yet executed the better one. They've cleared the space. They haven't built the ramp, and cleared space without a plan tends to fill with consumption. Social media, dining out, entertainment, things that cost money and generate nothing forward-looking. That is a real phenomenon. A refusal to participate in the bad deal without a replacement system is better for your sanity than overtime, but not significantly better for your net worth. The generation that actually wins this is not the one that just says no to overtime. It's the one that says no to overtime and builds something in the recovered time. That's the real move. And some of them are doing exactly that. Let me also spend a moment on the generational context here, because I think it's genuinely important for understanding why this is happening now rather than 20 years ago. From roughly the 1940s through the 1980s, the deal was real. You sold your time, you got a wage, the wage was sufficient to build a middle-class life, house, car, education for your kids, retirement at 65. The conveyor belt was actually moving toward the destination at a reasonable rate, and running a bit faster on it. Overtime, longer hours, more dedication genuinely did accelerate your arrival. The deal was functional. Then something started to happen. The returns on owning things began to dramatically outpace the returns on selling time. From 1990 to 2024, the S&P 500 generated something in the range of 10 to 11% annually, including dividends. Real median wage growth over the same period was roughly 2 to 3% annually after inflation. Home prices in most major metropolitan markets appreciated at rates that made wage-based savings trajectories look almost absurd by comparison. In other words, the return on owning things grew dramatically and persistently faster than the return on selling your hours. This divergence isn't a secret. Economists have been documenting and debating it for decades. The political implications have been enormous. But the behavioral implication that you should aggressively prioritize accumulating assets over accumulating hours took a generation to land as lived cultural reality rather than just an abstract economic observation. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up with that divergence as background noise. They didn't discover it as adults and have to unlearn previous conditioning. They grew up inside it. They watched their parents, who followed the overtime to prosperity playbook faithfully, struggle to afford homes in markets their grandparents bought casually with a single income. They watched the financial crisis of 2008 erase retirement savings from people who had done everything the system asked of them. Saved diligently, stayed loyal to employers, followed conventional advice. The crisis didn't discriminate between the people who had grinded 60-hour weeks and the people who had been more relaxed about it. It just erased. Loyalty and effort were not the protection most people assumed they were. Then the pandemic layoffs in 2020 demonstrated one more time definitively that corporate loyalty is a one-way mirror. Companies that had been publicly celebrating their employees' dedication for years laid off tens of thousands of them within weeks of a financial shock. Using the same language of regret and necessity that every layoff uses, regardless of how many overtime hours those employees had contributed, GenZ absorbed all of this before they entered the workforce. It was already in their cultural memory when they signed their first employment contracts. So when a company now asked them to work overtime to sell more of their genuinely finite time at a marginal tax-eroded premium, the gut response shaped by watching 2 decades of outcomes is, why would I do that when the actual game is owning things? And the gut response is correct. Now, let's come back to where we started, because I want to close the loop cleanly. Why does Gen Z refuse to work overtime? The simple answer that columns and LinkedIn posts serve you: they're entitled. They don't understand how the real world works. They haven't paid their dues. They want everything without earning it. They're soft. The actual answer, once you run the incentive analysis honestly, they correctly identified, collectively imperfectly sometimes without being able to articulate it, that overtime is a structurally poor financial trade in the specific tax environment, labor market and asset price landscape of the 2020s. They understood, as some level of intuition or analysis, that the overtime to prosperity pipeline that worked for prior generations operated in conditions that no longer exist. And many of them, consciously or through instinct, are trying to redirect that time towards structures that compound rather than structures that terminate at the end of each pay period. They are not refusing to work. They're refusing to run faster on a conveyor belt that doesn't go anywhere new regardless of your speed. The destination has moved. Running harder doesn't close the gap. Only stepping off and building something parallel does. To be fair, and I do want to be fair, this is not universal. There are absolutely people in this generation making purely comfort-based decisions with no financial strategy behind them. Declining overtime because you'd rather stay home and not do very much is not a system. It's just a preference. And preferences don't build wealth. Preferences don't compound. And there are people in this generation making genuinely strategic decisions that will define their financial trajectory for decades. Investing consistently through market downturns instead of panicking out. Building skills with real leverage. Running small businesses on weekends, compounding minor income streams into meaningful assets over years. Those people are going to look back at their 20s the way I think about the best moves I've made. Not with pride about how hard they grinded, but with clarity about how well they read the system. The conveyor belt is still real. Most of the time, you still need it. It's your base income while you build the ramp. The question is whether you spend every available additional hour running on it, or whether you take some of those hours and build something that runs parallel to it and doesn't stop generating returns when you step off. Here's what you actually do with all of this. First, run the real math on any overtime you're considering, not the gross rate, the net rate. Calculate your actual marginal after-tax hourly gain from overtime hours. Then compare it honestly and specifically to what you could generate in those same hours doing something with compounding properties, not what you might do in theory. What you would actually do if overtime nets you $17 per hour and you can realistically generate $35 per hour of value toward an asset, an investment account, a freelance skill, a content platform, anything that compounds. The math is definitive. Stop defaulting to overtime because it feels like the responsible choice. Responsible and familiar are not the same category. Second, move deliberately from level 2 to level 3. Refusing the bad trade is the beginning, not the destination. If you've stopped taking overtime, or if you're planning to define specifically what replaces it, not vaguely, not I'll invest more. Specifically, what account, what contribution amount, on what date, what skill are you building, and what's the concrete application you're working toward? What project, even a tiny one, are you building that could eventually generate income independent of your hourly presence? Unstructured time without a plan is very good at becoming consumption. Consumption doesn't compound. Or third, think honestly about the conveyor belts and your exposure to it. If your only income structure is if your entire financial existence depends on your continuous presence on the belt, your risk is entirely concentrated in one point of failure. Any disruption, a layoff, a health event, an industry shift, a restructuring, a bad manager can immediately destabilize your entire financial situation. The people who accumulate real wealth over time, at any age, almost universally, have one structural feature in common. They built income and asset structures that generate returns separate from their hourly labor. Some of them still work jobs, but the job isn't the whole machine anymore. It's one component of a larger system. Get there as early as you possibly can. The earlier the parallel ramp is started, the more compounding time it has and the less desperate every career decision becomes. The deepest irony in this entire conversation is this. The generation being criticized most loudly for not working hard enough might be the one that finally figured out what every wealthy person already knows but rarely says clearly. That working hard and building wealth are not the same equation. The generations that believed most completely that they were the same equation. They gave their best hours and their best years and their cognitive prime and their evenings to a conveyor belt. Many of them got to the other end of their careers and found the destination had moved again. Gen Z saw that outcome. They're adjusting. Whether they execute well on the adjustment, whether they actually fill the recovered hours with level 3 thinking rather than level 0 consumption is a separate and open question. But the diagnosis that the overtime system is a bad trade in the current incentive environment is correct. The instinct is right. The belt doesn't care how fast you run. Build the ramp. Subscribe.